So, Mark, welcome to Upstream Livestream, our lockdown edition, I guess.
Hi, Jim. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, good. Well, thanks for joining us. Now, Refinitiv, a multi-billion-dollar business, and yet one that probably few people have really know too much about. So perhaps you could start by telling us a bit about who Refinitiv are, what your story is, and what it is that you do.
Okay, great. So Refinitiv was born out of Thomson Reuters. And within Thomson Reuters, that there was a few businesses within that. So there's finance and risk, which is what we are. And there was also legal business, tax and accounting, and of course, Reuters news agency. We are a financial markets data infrastructure business. So we provide the financial markets with data. So think about the biggest banks that come to mind and the world's central banks, for example. We effectively run underneath the floorboards of those banks. We do a lot of data. Data is our business. And we also, as well as the biggest banks, of course, provide data to independent wealth advisors, for example, as well. And also a lot of machines, over 1 million different machines consume our data too.
Wow. So it's a lot of data. I mean, it's sort of sounds a bit like it's the fuel on which the engines of capitalism run, right? I mean, it's what's the role of that data? I mean, what function does that perform then for those banks and for those financial institutions?
Our role is, and the role of our platform, as we pull all the data together. So whether that's third-party data, public, private data, proprietary data, and we do really smart stuff with it. Things that I couldn't even begin to understand, but we basically things like aggregate it and we make sense of it, and then we deliver what people need to do their job, giving them what they need to make that next decision or make that next big deal, for example, or make the next decision for a portfolio that they might be looking after for a family or wealthy individual, for example.
Yeah, and I know at Refinitiv you're great believers in the union of creativity and data coming together. So it's not just about the data is somehow parsed and put through an algorithm, but you do a lot, don't you, to sort of add dimensions to that. I mean, otherwise, I guess the world would just be, everyone would make the same decision, wouldn't they? I mean, if it was all just about data, surely all decisions would be the same. But what is it that you guys do that makes that data usable in different ways? How does it result in different outcomes and decisions?
That's a really big question, Jim. There's many different answers to that. So I suppose the first point to make on the face of it is that it's quite dry. Okay, so if I said to you, I'm a creative director at a financial markets data infrastructure business, your eyes might start to glaze over. It's like, well, what does the role of creativity have within that? And obviously, from my side, I work in the marketing and comms function, but we have a phenomenal labs team, and they don't need me or anybody else to tell them how to be creative. Yeah. And they've got data scientists, engineers, developers working all the time on new ideas and how they can bring data and information to our customers even faster and be even more relevant, for example. But at the same time, the world is moving so fast in the world of financial markets that we need to make sure that we're there for the customers during that change, and if anything, help them advance at that speed of change, right? Yeah. Which is our value proposition. That's what we believe in. That's what we're here to do. Yeah. So let me give you one example. So what's a huge change in the last decade is when you think of a banker or even a trader, you would maybe imagine 6 big screens in front of them, and they're picking up the phone and making lots of calls. Well, and you would never associate necessarily them with coding, but now there's a new breed of banker, and they're bankers that code, or financial professionals that code, and so they're wanting to almost test their own hypotheses, and they want to test their own ideas. So we need to make sure we're there for those folks, as well as the people that just want to consume the data, for people that want to test and be creative with data themselves.
It's really, I'm intrigued by the idea of the bankers of the future are kind of super coders, as opposed to people who can sort of perhaps the sort of stereotypical view of just existing in the hustle and the bustle of the deal, and it's quite an interesting environment. Do you have a view about the evolution of the financial markets and the extent to which the way we view value in companies and inevitably therefore in economies changes and shapes as the data sources become more wide and rich in their potential?
When I think about brand and the language we use and the values and even the personality of that brand, you need to make sure today that you still have, in our world, in the world of financial markets, that we can still instill trust, still say, we've got deep market expertise. We really believe, we've got the most phenomenal trusted data, for example, to provide our customers. But at the same time, put your front foot forward and lean into the change in a really positive way, and at the speed our customers have to change. So brand now has to be so much faster, so much more adaptive, but not adaptive for the sake of it without losing who you are. Just almost double down on your personality, in fact. And I think that's one of the unique things that we've got, which really excites me about Refinitiv. It's so new. It's 2018. We're not even 2 years old. And we were very purposeful about who we were now going to be. So to be clear, we're not a blue finance and risk business Thomson Reuters. We haven't just gone from orange to blue. So we were just talking about the open platform, for example, and we've made investments in products and how we show up, and the brand has to reflect that. So I think it's, but at the same time, and I'm sure we'll talk about our legacy as well, it's just really important that we just move forward with trust, but at the speed you have to, which is a very different role, again, to the way that brands had to play. I think brands in 10, 20 years ago was more about, let's just keep as we are, not rock the boat too much, because customers will get nervous if we rock the boat too much. I hope that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. I mean, I've been on my sort of hobby horse for at least a decade now about the whole notion of trust and financial services, because I think it gets talked about far too flippantly, actually, by a lot of financial service institutions. As I often say, trust is the foundational principle of money itself. There's a bit of paper that says that you are going to be given something in exchange for it. And, I think there's always been, certainly at the consumer banking level, a challenge, I think, among a lot of marketeers about what does it really take to get people to switch banks or to engage with a new provider. And it's not really about trust per se. I mean, you put all your money in a bank, you've got to trust them, but I think it is much more what you're describing. It's behavior, it's deeper levels of engagement.
I don't think that 10, 20 years ago we would necessarily be talking about, I talk a lot about emotive content within data. So we were speaking earlier about data can be perceived as very dry, where in fact, one of the things that we've even done with yourselves is dramatize what is data, what does it enable us to do, and really merging data and creativity, which in my view are the two most valuable yet intangible commodities we've got in the world right now. So if you look at solving any issue today, environmental crisis, financial crisis, a pandemic, what do you need? You need a lot of data, and you need a lot of really smart new thinking to get yourself, either out of that situation or make the most of the opportunity of the situation. I talk a lot, obviously, about having a more of a consumer front as well when we market. I find it bizarre, the notion sometimes of B2C and B2B and the differentiation of that, because consumers today are so smart and they're so used to having phenomenal UI in their hand and being marketed to in certain ways, but then they step inside the office and then they get B2B marketing and creative thrown at them, which in the finance sector, to be fair, is pretty dry, and there's huge white space for us to go in and say it doesn't need to be that way. We can come at this with more of a consumer angle, make it really emotive and exciting and engaging, and have a deeper and richer experience with you, while we're still talking about financial markets and data.
Yeah.
It is possible.
Well, I mean, I've often puzzled around this as well. I mean, there's this thing that people go to work and dress in a way that they don't at home, and they use language and words at work that they never would at home. And I wonder whether one of the outcomes, I suppose, of the COVID-19 working from home experience, it might even be that people start to appreciate that the dividing line between who they are at home and who they are at work is perhaps not as great. I mean, I actually think it's wonderful that we all see each other in our homes when we talk, and it humanizes it more. And it can only be a good thing in my book if we sort of break down the artificial distinction between who people are at work and who they are at home. And so I'm on board with that. I think the more B2B acknowledges that people are people and they make decisions as humans, the better it is in that book. My view of strong brands is you have a really strong core set of principles that define who you are, how you want to show up in the world. You can call them vision and purpose, you can call them positioning, you can call them values. There are various different ways that one can articulate what they are, but you have to have a really strong sense of who you are as a brand. And I think everything else is actually really about individuals. I think then it's about how do you connect with people at an individual level. So the less generalization there is, the better. I think in global companies, it's less and less about which market people actually sit in, and it's more about what is their mindset. There's more like-mindedness sometimes between people who are on opposite sides of the world than there is in people who sit next to each other. And so I think it's about identifying mindsets and looking at things in those ways. I think in any sales environment, it's really, really important that businesses have a strong, rational message and reason to buy the product. And I think where brand is sometimes criticized, I suppose, as a discipline, is where it focuses too much on sort of lofty narrative and not enough on fact and information. And I think as a brand consultant, part of our role is to help organizations be clear about what they need to do themselves in order to put themselves in a position of advantage. So where are the gaps in your narrative that need to be filled with fact and rational? Right. But I'm totally with you. This is a narrative-driven environment. I mean, people have a plethora of communications and pieces of information coming at them, and the ones they engage with would be the narratives that they enjoy, I think, and want to be part of, and in some ways help to sort of co-create and shape. So yes, I agree with you. I mean, a narrative at the core of your brand is, I think, crucial.
Yeah. And I think what we've seen, which has been coming back to the how new the Refinitiv brand is and how we've moved as quick as we have, is actually, I don't know, maybe an analogy would be, and this might not come out quite right, I'll give it a go, is that, in a branding terms, first of all, it just absolutely cannot sit at one corner of the organisation. And it was Eileen Lynch, our Chief Marketing Officer, we were having a conversation when we were a year in. What do we think has been the major catalyst for our brand success, as it were? And Eileen put it down to the fact that brand, business strategy and culture from day one were absolutely in sync with each other. And I think that, coming back to maybe an analogy, is that brand, which are those visions and purpose and narratives, which we all had to start from scratch, right? I mean, we saw ourselves as the $6 billion startup with 167 years of heritage, which is I love that tension and that idea. But I mean, we weren't a startup, right? We had a lot. We had 40,000 customers, 400,000 end users, for example. But from branding terms, we really were. So we had to create that kind of 2D part of it, which is what we look like, what we sound like, our personality and our logo and all that kind of stuff. But then when we think about the other bits, the culture and the business strategy, that's almost like the third dimension. And actually, the deeper that goes, the more solid the whole thing becomes, and then the more the business gets behind it. And there was nervousness of people that have been in business for 10, 20 years. It's like, it's all going to be new, what are we going to be like? And suddenly something twigged for me last year about brand being something very different, because I don't think anybody's ever really defined what brand ever is. I think there's a lot of conversation around that.
Never.
But for me, it's almost like the deeper it goes on that Z-axis almost. then the more powerful it becomes, because then you've got everybody speaking exactly from the same platform. And I think for example, our IoT did an amazing job at that. Whether you were hearing from our chief people officer or our CEO or chief marketing officer, they would all speak using the same language from day one, and they would all really celebrate the brand, and I think that really helped to shape us and put the glue that really brought it all together. And of course the kind of like final part of that, which we're working on right now, is what's the stamp. If you've designed this perfect box over the past year, that's great and everything looks fantastic, but how do you certify that box? And obviously that's the voice of the customer, because it's all very well us saying who we are and what we want to achieve, but I think what's really interesting now is like bringing out those customer stories to validate that, and actually that also speaks to our heritage, and we can start drawing out the trust that we have in the market, because for some people we're just another fintech startup, and people don't know how big we are. So yeah, it's really, it always gets quite difficult to articulate exactly what brand is and how you move and how you communicate on a human to human level, but I think there's a lot in there to package together and make it fit together and make sense for the market, and the more that everyone can come together and make sense of it, the better.
I'm interested in how you see the future. What is the next it's very hard, right, to see what's happening next week in the world at the moment, but I'm going to ask you to try and extrapolate forward. What excites you about the years ahead?
I think I'm excited about, just like you were talking about, there's some phenomenal companies in the world where they really have those cultures where anybody, irrespective of how long you've been in the organization or your level, come up with ideas at any time. And I think that's all part of developing that kind of creative culture or ideation culture. And I think there's 4 simple parts to it. I think we need to be really generous in giving and receiving ideas. And the receiving ideas is interesting. We're having a conversation just today about that point, that we sometimes can be good at giving them, but not so good at receiving the ideas on the other end, and not allowing them to breathe even, and shutting them down quite quickly. We don't have enough money to do that. We don't have enough time to do that. We can't do that. So we need to be generous with that. We also need to search for inspiration way outside of our own walls, way outside, not even our own sector, not even B2B, way outside. At the same time, we need to, when we do look inside our walls, look at other departments that we don't interact with. They're doing amazing things. And big companies like ours, you don't always get to see all the things that you're even doing within your own walls. So search deeper in your own walls and way outside. And I think that also that healthy disregard for your past, I think that's critical, especially with a brand like ours. And I think John Slade from the FT, I watched an interview that he did with him. It was really fascinating. It felt like there's something similar to us in that they've got all this heritage. They want to be current, like we are. We want to be current and moving forward with the trends. But at the same time, you don't want to just disregard what you've come from and that deep heritage and that trust that you've built. So it's having that healthy disregard for where you've come from, right, and deviating, but in a nice way from where you've come from. And I think that's important. And I think the 4th one is just really communicating well. I've seen amazing ideas fall flat on their faces, and it's because we need to remember we're salespeople. I say often, people are kind of shocked by that, but I see myself in my role. I sell every single day, whether that's a new visual creative, new language, a new idea. And if I don't articulate it well enough to the right people, it won't go any further. So I think there's some concepts in that, and that's why I'm excited about how can we get everybody on this journey. And you said something interesting about people say, this is the exciting part of my day or week. I don't think it needs to just be a small part of someone's week. I think we should all be bringing that excitement to work and energy in different ways than maybe we are today.
Every minute of every day. I couldn't agree more. And Mark, that feels like a great place to leave it. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you here in our home edition of Upstream Livestream. So thanks so much for joining us, and very best of luck with the future at Refinitiv.
Thanks for having me, and stay safe and well, Jim.
Thank you.